Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for August 19th, 2021. I'm going to stick with the topic of Afghanistan because there are a couple of points that absolutely must be internalized by especially the Americans, but also people in Western Europe, if we're to take advantage of what has been a horrible crisis to move into a new era of peaceful cooperation and development. That's the potential that the fall of Kabul offers us, an opportunity to overcome the errors in judgment and thinking, not of the American people, but of the politicians, of the media, of the so-called experts, of the intelligence community, the war departments, and so on, who kept telling us that war was the only solution. Now, 2 weeks before the fall of Kabul, the Schiller Institute held a conference on July 31st. And the conference was Afghanistan, a turning point in history after the failed regime change era. And what was presented was a group of people who were experts in various fields from various countries to discuss what could be done to move into a new paradigm. Remember, this was 2 weeks before the fall of Kabul, when virtually no one was forecasting the rapid collapse of the US-imposed government. Now, this conference was convened by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who said that we have to provide a perspective of where to go from here. Don't leave it to the people who created this crisis. We, the people, have to impose a perspective. This is the end of an epoch. And she said that it was clear, even before Kabul fell, that there is no military solution. And she said the solution rests with putting development on the table. Hussein Askari from the Executive Intelligence Review Mideast desk said that we must make development the first item in the talks. And he said, bring in Afghanistan's neighbors, bring in the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, Iranians, and others, Pakistanis. But he said it's necessary to keep the warlords and the British out. Now, the warlords and the British want more war. They need more war. The British are obviously nostalgic for the days when the Great Game was the only game in town, and where British diplomacy depended on manipulating countries against each other, and especially using the United States as an enforcer of imperial policy. But you hear the calls for more war from many people in the United States. The lunatic Liz Cheney, whose father got us into these endless wars in the first place, making a mockery of the idea of endless wars, saying these are necessary. William Kristol, one of the most important figures in the neoconservative movement, talking about premature withdrawal. Now, after 20 years and spending trillions of dollars and more than 2,500 American casualties, as well as hundreds of thousands of Afghans displaced, killed, and maimed, we need more war, according to these people? Now, this Saturday, many of the participants in that July 31st conference will be convening again for an absolutely necessary follow-up dialogue on what to do. And there is no time to lose. We saw what happened after 1989-1990, when the opportunity to shift from the Soviet Union as an adversary in the Cold War to an ally in economic development was lost because of the role of the British and the British politicians in the United States, the Wall Street crowd, and the Bush crowd and others, who used the situation to loot Russia as opposed to offer Russia an honorable peace and an opportunity for development. Now, as we reported yesterday, the Taliban has made promises since they came into power. Now, given their past record, it's not surprising that people would be skeptical. But the people who are skeptical are posing as a solution sending back troops or cutting off everything completely and let the people of Afghanistan suffer even more than they've suffered that we imposed on them. Now, Afghanistan's neighbors, including Russia and China, are taking a different approach. What they're saying is make the recognition of the Taliban government conditional upon Taliban following through on some of their promises. And these include that they will not support from their territory terrorists, separatists, or extremists. They will not allow their land to be used for groups that are going to operate against the United States and other countries. They've also said there will be no retribution, no revenge for people who served the U.S., the British, NATO, and so on, and that they will not go back to their treatment of women that characterized their previous reign. Now, they also, very importantly, promised to shut down opium production. And as one of our speakers at the July 31st conference mentioned, that more than 95% of the profit from opium goes to organized crime and to money launderers of banks and financial institutions, not to the farmers who grow the poppies. And that there had been efforts to shut down production before that were sabotaged by the US, the European Union, and NATO. Of course, don't lose sight of the fact that the drug wars have long been an important part of the British Great Game, going back to the Opium Wars in the middle of the 19th century, including the launching of the rock, sex, drug counterculture in the United States in the 1960s, and the continued central role of London and Wall Street banks and some Swiss banks in laundering drug money. Now, while doing these things, what's necessary is to provide some positive incentive. And this comes mostly from China and the Belt and Road Initiative, with support from Russia, support from other countries, and it should get support from the Americans. And this would include extending the China-Pakistan corridor as a corridor of economic development, which brings Afghanistan into the Belt and Road Initiative to serve as a logistics hub for transport, including modern transportation, road building, and so on. Investment in power production, in water management, and aid for food production to replace the proceeds from drugs. These things are all possible. They could have been done at any point in the last 40 years. Now, let me be as direct as possible using language I don't usually use. But it's time for people like Liz Cheney, William Kristol, and Nikki Haley to shut the fuck up. Who do they think they're talking for when they call for sending back troops? When they say that we have to continue the fight, when we have to continue what has not worked for 20 years and will not work for another 100 years. Whose sons and daughters are they willing to sacrifice for the unholy profits that are made by the Wall Street and London speculators who control the arms markets and the so-called nation-building industry? They don't speak for you, they don't speak for me. They speak for a small number of corporate cartels who hijacked control over U.S. policy. That must end, and we can use this collapse of their policies in Afghanistan as the opportunity to put them out of business once and for all. The potential for cooperation has never been greater. The idea that we would be the policemen of the world in imposing a unilateral order won't work. However, what if the United States were to join with Russia and China and India, Iran, and other countries in making a model of development out of Afghanistan, take it from its torn apart state at present, and provide the modern components of a new platform of infrastructure that would uplift immediately the prospects of the future for the children who are otherwise suffering under the conditions of war. After 20 years of destruction, it will take a little bit of patience. It will take some diplomacy. But better to have patience for that than to insist on a global paradigm that says that countries such as Afghanistan should be looted for their raw materials and their cheap labor, but should have nothing invested in their future. This would be a decisive defeat for the war hawks and the global corporate cartels of Wall Street, London, the European Union, and NATO. But that's what's necessary today. So join us this Saturday. The discussion that we'll have will be a follow-up to the one 3 weeks ago. You can go back and watch that on the schillerinstitute.com. But come with an open mind and a commitment to the idea that pessimism is one of the biggest problems we face. So thanks for joining me today. Tomorrow is Friday. I'll take your questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com. Thanks, and see you then.